Today's video is brought to you by Surfshark. Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today, I'm looking at a video on the channel Christianity 9 to 5 called The Moral Standards Argument for the Existence of God. It's been a hot minute since I've tackled a video exclusively on the moral argument, so I thought I'd give this one a look. So let's see if they find an angle on it that's actually convincing. But first, a word from our sponsor, Surfshark. Are you getting tired of scrolling through your streaming services, not being able to find something new and interesting to watch? Do you live in a place that has overly intrusive controls over streaming sites featuring certain specific types of stimulating content? Well then, have I got a solution for you! Surfshark VPN is a virtual private network which allows you to appear to be connected to the internet from any location where Surfshark has a server. By connecting through Surfshark, you can access streaming services from different geographic locations. This means you may have access to additional libraries of movies and TV shows that aren't available in your home area. But that's not all they do. With their Clean Web 2.0 features, you can automatically block ads, reject unwanted cookies without fumbling through the pop-up first, get alerts when a website was the target of a data breach, and block malware. Seriously, if Clean Web 2.0 were the only product they offered, that would be more than worth the price just for getting rid of the cookies pop-up. But considering you also get a VPN that adds an extra layer of encryption to your data, keeping you safe when connected to public networks even if they've been compromised, it's a steal. Surfshark VPN is easy to use and simple to install. They do not monitor, track, or store your data, and it works on phones, tablets, and laptops with no extra fees. Surfshark offers a 30-day money-back guarantee so you can try it out completely risk-free. Secure your privacy with Surfshark. Enter coupon code Rhino for an extra 4 months free at surfshark.com/Rhino. Again, that's surfshark.com/RHINO and enter promo code Rhino for an extra 4 months free. This is a limited time offer, so sign up today. And remember, by signing up for Surfshark, you're helping to support my channel. Thank you.
Now consider this. Many people who are skeptical about whether God exists still tend to have pretty strong convictions about how we should live.
Yep, it's pretty normal to have strong opinions about things, irrespective of culture, religion, upbringing, etc. Of course, not everyone agrees on those opinionated topics, which is actually the whole reason that conflict exists in the first place. It's a bunch of people trying to convince other people that their strong opinion is the correct opinion.
About how the world should be, about what's right and what's wrong. Now, what's the problem with that? Let's find out. So you ask for an example of something that is wrong in the world.
I'm gonna go ahead and say it. Mint is morally wrong and should not be in anything. And to make use of the appeal to nature fallacy, the fact that mint can be used as a repellent for everything from mice to mosquitoes proves that I am objectively correct here.
And they say something like genocide, or terrorism, or child molestation, or human trafficking, or racism, or whatever they say. Your response, yes, I agree.
Yeah, there are a lot of big-ticket moral items that most people have no problem agreeing with. Notably, the things that have the most agreement also happen to be the things that, evolutionarily speaking, would have had the strongest selection pressures working on them. Killing is bad. It's a really easy sentiment to get to, evolutionarily speaking. If we all went around killing each other every time we got mad, that would place a pretty big negative selection pressure on our survival as a species. Harming children, who are the people who will be responsible for continuing to propagate the species after we're done with our turn, would also be a pretty big negative selection pressure on our survival as a species. So stuff like that's easy.
And why is that wrong?
Because empathy exists. My question is why apologists can't seem to wrap their heads around right and wrong being based in well-being. Is it really that difficult to conceptualize the idea that I don't like being harmed, and that this preference can largely be generalized? Do unto others as you would have others do unto you was a thing long before Jesus ever said it. Possibly the oldest iteration of the Golden Rule comes from the ancient Egyptian tale of the eloquent peasant, a story that was likely written about 1,000 years earlier than the oldest estimated date for the oldest book of the Bible. And yet you're telling me that I need to get my moral code from your God?
Well, now, don't miss this. Unless they point to some sort of supreme lawgiver who determines moral behavior for all people, at all times, well, then their answer to why is that wrong has to be subjective. In other words, it has to be based on merely personal opinion or societal norms.
And why exactly is that automatically a bad thing in your eyes? Is it somehow better if you can say it's wrong because this super powerful being said so and he'll torture you for all eternity if you disagree with him about it? I would rather base my morality in empathy, even if that is subjective, than in a system of might makes right. And ultimately, God's morality is subjective as well. It just shifts the subject from being human beings to God. Why is a thing right or wrong? Because it's God's opinion that it is right or wrong. Why is that better than it being based in the opinions of the people who are actually directly impacted by moral questions?
So why is genocide wrong? Well, everybody knows that it's wrong. Actually, that's a subjective opinion. Everybody doesn't know that it's wrong, otherwise it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't happen.
And that is how you know that a universal moral code is not written on our hearts. You're undercutting your own argument here. The whole point of the argument is that everybody does know that it's wrong, and the reason everybody knows it's wrong is because it's part of the moral law that God implants in our brains somehow. So the fact that everybody does not, in fact, know that even these big-ticket items are wrong is itself evidence that the moral argument does not work. Of course, apologists will try to rescue this by blaming it on the fall. We're fallen humans with free will, and that somehow means that it can be simultaneously true that most people agreeing on morality means that a God exists because God gives us all his moral code, and that not everyone agrees on this moral code despite God giving it to all of us because, the fall, or whatever. It's a have your cake and eat it too argument. Heads I win, tails you lose.
So why is genocide wrong?
Honestly, that's actually a really good question that I don't think you can answer properly, given your God's penchant for both commanding his followers to commit genocide and directly committing genocide himself. So just keep that in mind when he starts complaining that human standards are arbitrary and subject to change. His standard allows for genocide and slavery to be morally permissible.
Well, it's illegal. Actually, the law is subjective too, in the sense that it's based on societal norms at the time. It's been different in other times in different places. Might be different in the future.
Yep. Almost like we don't get our law from a perfect lawgiver, but have to figure out what works best on our own over time.
So why is genocide wrong?
Because it does massive amounts of harm and provides little to realistically no benefit.
Well, because it harms people, and obviously harming people is wrong.
Yeah. Is that really such a bad metric to use?
Well, you see, even that is subjective. What if there's somebody else out there who doesn't think that harming people is wrong?
Then, as it turns out, we live in a society. Most of us do agree that harming other people is wrong. So the people that disagree, in order to live in society, have to adhere to society's rules. Plenty of people who exist who have things like antisocial personality disorder, where they don't experience the same level of empathy as most people, but still manage to live relatively ordinary lives through an application of things like pragmatism.
So is there any objective, unchanging, immovable basis for us saying that genocide is wrong?
Yes. Genocide always does significantly more harm than good, and so is always wrong.
Or that anything is wrong, for that matter.
The harm versus benefit metric. Sure, it's not strictly speaking objective, but I don't understand why apologists think a moral system must necessarily be truly objective in order to be valid. They just assume that everyone will axiomatically agree with that point, and then move on without justifying it. Usually as part of an argument that acknowledges that morality is subjective, as he already did by pointing out that different people have different moral codes.
Not without an ultimate authority. Not without a supreme lawgiver. In other words, not without God. Okay.
Not without might makes right, like I said.
This is called the moral standards argument for the existence of God, or the argument from morality. It's been around for a very long time. Immanuel Kant, maybe a name you've heard of, maybe the most famous celebrated philosopher in the last 1,000 years, made this argument so eloquently, so powerfully. And C.S. Lewis popularized this argument in his book, Mere Christianity. And here's an excerpt from the book on this question of morality.
Oh, fuck me. I thought he was actually going to just, present the argument, but apparently he rambles so much that the people who put his own video together felt the need to cut out an unknown amount of what he said. That awkward cut wasn't me, and there's more coming.
Lewis says this, says the moment you say that one set of moral ideals can be better than another, in other words, no genocide is better than genocide. The moment you say that one set of moral ideals can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by some standard, saying that one of them conforms to that standard more nearly than the other.
Not necessarily. If you lay two sticks side by side and say that one is longer than the other, you aren't comparing those sticks to some objective standard of length. But what's really interesting here to me is that this quote comes one page after Lewis said, though there are differences between the moral ideas of one time or country and those of another, the differences are not really very great. Which, on its face, seems like it's just a minor oversimplification that minimizes the cultural differences in morality to a greater extent than is warranted. But when you realize that he literally wrote that during the height of World War II and was aware of what the Nazis were doing and frequently used them as an example of immorality, it blows the top off the yikesometer. Or yikesometer. I feel like it should be yikesometer, but then I feel like it should also be yikesometer. I'm not sure. Comment down below. Let me know. Yikesometer or yikesometer? But putting the strange way he can say that cultures don't really have big moral differences while still using the Nazis as an example of a bad culture, let's borrow an analogy that Lewis used earlier in that chapter. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play on the piano. Our instincts merely take the keys. But when watching a pianist perform, how do we determine whether they did a good job or not? Well, by comparing what they played to the notes on the sheet music. The sheet music itself is arbitrarily chosen, but how closely the pianist adheres to the music can be objectively determined. Same with morality. If we agree that a net increase in well-being is a good goal to aim for, then when taking an action, we can objectively determine if that action increased or decreased the well-being. So a goal may be subjectively chosen, much as a song that a pianist plays, but you can still objectively measure morality based on it.
And his point is that we can't claim that something is moral or immoral, right or wrong, for all people at all times across all cultures, unless we recognize that there's a higher authority than what people think. And frankly, true atheists fully recognize the validity of this argument.
Keep in mind here, he's using valid in the philosophical sense, which does not mean that the argument actually works. It just means that it would work if all the premises were true. And given that he hasn't actually laid out a philosophical argument, it looks like he's gotten confused in this point himself. So let's look at an actual formulation of the moral argument, shall we? I'll take the version that William Lane Craig favors, as he's generally very highly regarded among Christians, despite his admission that he lowers the epistemic bar that Christianity must meet to be believed, simply because he wanted it to be true.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it.
Premise 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. To say that this is a valid argument is not to say that it is true. It is simply to say that the conclusion actually does follow from those premises. So the only way to show this argument to be false is to show one or more of the premises to be false. Now, personally, I am not one of the atheists who thinks that this is a valid argument. Both the premises are flawed. I don't think that objective moral values and duties do exist, and even if they did, I don't see how they would necessarily be contingent on the existence of a god. In fact, quite the contrary, if they require the existence of a subject in order to exist, then they are necessarily subjective. Apologists just don't seem to be able to grasp the concept of God being a subject. I feel like this argument is almost the opposite of what it should actually be. If objective moral values and duties do exist, they exist independent of the existence of any beings of any kind, including gods. Therefore, the existence or non-existence of God is actually irrelevant to the existence or non-existence of objective moral values and duties.
To be consistent, they have to contend that there's no real right and wrong in the world.
And in order to be consistent, you have to ignore cultural differences in order to make it look like objective moral values and duties exist, and somehow transcend cultures, despite the fact that is not the case.
Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous atheist on the planet today, said this quite directly. He said, "The universe we observe has no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference."
Okay. That doesn't say anything about the validity of the argument. That is simply an observation. The universe doesn't care about us, or things like baby cancer wouldn't exist.
Wow. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. It's actually an echo of Friedrich Nietzsche from 150 years ago, of God is Dead fame.
A quote that unfortunately spawned a series of Christian propaganda films that depict a distorted view of reality in order to exert political influence, the 5th installment of which is in theaters now. Seriously, they have a profitable movie-making business that regularly capitalizes on the perception that Christians are being oppressed and persecuted. If the picture they paint of the United States in those movies were even a little bit true, they wouldn't be allowed to make those movies.
And Nietzsche insisted that if there is no God, in other words, if God is dead, then the idea of morality is completely baseless.
Okay, you're giving me less to go on to find context here than Mike Winger did when he misconstrued Nietzsche's work. But whether or not he said that and actually meant what you are saying he meant, I disagree with it. We can base our morality in broadly accepted goals. You might not like that as a base because you have this weird hang-up about ultimate objectivity, but for those of us who are willing to be more pragmatic, it's fine. But also, to take it back to Nietzsche, because I apparently can't let things slide, as it happens, his views on moral philosophy are extremely difficult to parse, to the point where it's actually a current area of philosophical debate, with philosophers trying to piece together what he thought about morality by sifting through all of his work, figuring out where he was being serious, where he was using hyperbole, and where he was being tongue-in-cheek. So while I'm not comfortable saying exactly what Nietzsche thought about morality with any sort of confidence, I can confidently say that his position is almost certainly not as simple as God is dead, therefore morality has no basis.
Merely subjective. No reason to be kind to anyone or even civil. No reason to care about others, no reason to work for justice, no basis for any human rights.
Why are the consequences of your actions considered no reason in your mind? Is, if I am civil and kind to people, they will also be civil and kind to me, not a reason to be civil and kind? Sure, you might complain that that's a selfish reason, but that doesn't make it not a reason. And what about empathy? Is empathy no reason? Because there's more than just reciprocation. There's also, I know or can imagine what it's like to be in that situation, so I will do something to help, because not helping makes me feel bad for them. That's a reason, is it not? It's not even a selfish one, so you can't just dismiss it as being a reason you don't like, as you might do with the expectation of reciprocation. Why is the basis of increasing human well-being no basis in your mind? Why is it objective or nothing? And really, given that human morality impacts, humanity, why do we get no say in the creation of a basis for human morality? Like, seriously, you keep arguing that a god has to exist in order for objective morality to exist, which I disagree with. That would still be a form of subjective morality. But if I grant that that counts as objective for some reason, why should I care whether the basis for morality is objective or subjective? Y'all just assume that objective is superior, but your objective moral code has provisions for slavery and genocide, which modern morality that has subjectively changed over time as we as a species went through a process of learning and growth, says that they're always wrong now. Why should we go back to the regressive, slavery-endorsing, genocide-permitting, anti-LGBTQ moral code of the ancient Hebrews when modern morality, as subjective as it may be, is objectively better for human outcomes? Hell, the very fact that morality is subjective actually makes it better than your objective biblical-based morality. Because if there's something that we think is morally permissible, but through a process of learning, we figure out that it actually has a negative impact on the overall well-being of us as a species, we can update our morality to include that information. By not being set in stone, we are free to change it when we figure out that it needs to be changed. So why would I want a strict, unyielding morality that has objectively worse outcomes, even if the source of that morality were actually objective? Especially since the very apologists who argue for God because they see no other way to ground morality can be found pivoting to the very same consequentialist moral system that I'm suggesting here when difficult subjects like genocide show up.
We need to understand this was not an arbitrary ethnic cleansing. But in fact, this is a specific judgment on a morally degraded people.
God's command for Israel to drive out the Canaanites was not race-based, but behavior-based, as the Canaanites engaged in acts that would be considered criminal in civilized societies.
First, it starts off with incest, and then it goes into adultery, then it goes into offering your children to Molech, homosexual sins, and then bestiality. And we know from Canaanite primary source documents that all of these things were being practiced by the Canaanites.
He gives reasons, right? He doesn't just wake up like a mob boss and go, Canaanites, I want them dead, right? He's got reasons for it. And probably the biggest reason, after 400 years of warning, is that the Canaanites were sacrificing their children on the molten hot god Molech, this idol.
The culture that is described there, this was one that practiced not only all sorts of human sexual aberrations, but also temple prostitution in the worship of God. They practiced bestiality. There are texts describing how a buck would be strapped down to a wooden frame, and then women would mount the buck and copulate with it. They were engaged in offering child sacrifice to their gods. And so reading these ancient documents that are from pre-Israelite Canaan really bear out the truth of the biblical description of them.
Not a single one of those people said that the Canaanite genocide was okay because the order to wipe them out came from God, who is the source of all morality. They all appealed to the behavior of the Canaanites as the reason their destruction was justified. So since apologists can't even be consistent when it comes to their supposedly objective source of morality, why is it a bad thing that I am advocating for a type of morality that these apologists all appeal to when they're put in a tight spot by the scriptures that they claim are morally perfect?
It's horrifying, isn't it?
Why is it horrifying that I won't accept a moral code that allows for slavery and genocide? In what world is that horrifying?
I heard this news story the other day of parents who are on trial for starving their 2 young boys.
And I heard this news story the other day that people are eating dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio. But when you actually look at the source of the story, it wound up literally being an acquaintance of a friend of the original poster's daughter. Now, why do I bring this up? Mainly, I just want an excuse to play this.
We're the sauce on your sandwich, cheese and butter. We put the spring in Springfield.
They're eating the cats. They're eating the dogs. They're eating the pets in Springfield.
Also, I'm skipping the rest of the story. People do bad things sometimes. That's not a problem for atheism. We're not the ones that have to explain how bad things are possible when there's an all-powerful magical man in the sky who could prevent bad things from happening if he actually wanted to, because we don't believe in the all-powerful magical man in the sky.
Now, why am I telling you this story? Notice that an atheist can't even call that behavior wrong.
Why not? Starving children harms them, resulting in an increase in net harm. And if our goal is to maximize well-being, starving children can be shown objectively to get us farther away from that goal, and so can be said to not just be wrong, but objectively wrong.
Why? Because there's no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference in the universe.
You're mischaracterizing that statement. Let me read the full quote with some added context. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. He's not saying that there is no good or evil in the universe in the sense that we cannot look at an action or behavior and decide for ourselves that it is good or evil. He's saying that the universe that we observe is much more closely aligned with the idea that there is not an omnibenevolent, all-powerful being watching over us than that there is. So we can look at parents starving their children, declare it to be morally repugnant, and not have to explain how an all-powerful, all-loving God allowed it to happen.
And I suspect that many people who think of themselves as atheists really have no idea the monstrous implications of that worldview.
Even if I grant that what you are saying is correct, which, let's be clear, it's absolutely not, but even if I grant that, that's nothing more than an argument from consequences. I do not like the implications of God not existing, therefore, God must exist. That is what we find at the root of the moral argument for God. But like I said, it's not even true. The monstrous implication here is that we as a society can get better. As much as we've gotten better in the last few centuries, there's still more improvements that we can make, and rather than being rigidly opposed to any change because that would mean morality isn't objective, we can evaluate potential changes to find out which ones will have better outcomes for us all.
Again, this is the moral standards argument, or the argument for morality. But please don't miss the larger point here. Right? All this falls under this general question of how should we live? And the only way to have a rational, defensible answer to that is to agree that a supreme being is there who determines right and wrong.
He just has failed to communicate that to us in any definitive way. And this is evidenced by the fact that Christian infighting over morality is quite prevalent. Is it moral to allow women to be pastors? Is it moral to accept LGBTQ people for who they are? Is it moral to use a drum set during worship service? These are all questions where a disagreement about the answers have caused church schisms. If there really is one objective moral truth that God gives to us, you'd think that the people who believe in the God who gave us this moral truth would be the ones who are most in line with that truth, but as it turns out, they can't even decide amongst themselves what that truth even is. That's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Nicholas Cale Music 982, who says, "The Christian deity isn't omniscient or omnipresent, and never has this been as demonstrated than by asking where the only two people in existence were after they ate the fruit. Also doesn't have the power to make themselves omniscient or omnipresent, and therefore is not omnipotent, or they would have done so, assuming the idea occurred to them. Draw what conclusions you choose from this." Counterpoint: if I were omnipotent, maybe I would choose to make myself omniscient, but I definitely wouldn't go for omnipresent, because then every time someone takes a shit, they do so directly into your mouth, and that is very much something I do not want. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to go to surfshark.com/rhino for 4 bonus months for free. I'll be back next Friday with more, but if you need to get your Rhino fix in before then, I live stream with Surus every Wednesday, 8:30 Eastern on my other channel, The Watering Hole. Thanks to Tim Robertson for being my Patreon and sponsorships manager, and special thanks as always to my patrons, who are the basis for the morality that is my channel. If you'd like to be objectively amazing, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino, or by supporting the channel in one of the other methods that can be found at links.vicerhino.com, which is also where you'll find links to my other projects. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See ya next time! This is a valid argument. Both... Puddles, stop. Stop. Stop running. Stop running. You're being loud. You want to be in the video? You want to be in the video? You want to come here? No, you don't want to be in the video. Sorry guys, she don't want to be in the video. I asked. She said no. As a society, Susudio. That's not how that song goes.